Joseph Kosuth γεννήθηκε το 1945 στο Τολίντο του Οχάιο. Από το 1991 μέχρι το 1997 κατήχε καθηγητική έδρα στην Κρατική Ακαδημία Εικαστικών Τεχνών της Στουτγκάρδης. Ζει και εργάζεται στη Νέα Υόρκη και στη Στουτγκάρδη. Ο Joseph Kosuth εκπροσωπεί κατά κύριο λόγο την αμερικανική ενοιολογική τέχνη. Η τέχνη του δεν ασχολείται με αισθητικά ή εικονογραφικά ζητήματα, αλλά με θέματα ορισμού. Το πρώιμο έργο του Joseph Kosuth είναι επηρεασμένο από τις σκέψεις του εξέχοντος εκπροσώπου της φιλοσοφίας της γλώσσας Ludwig Wittgenstein. Ο Joseph Kosuth έχει διαδραματίσει σημαντικό ρόλο στην αλλαγή του τρόπου αντίληψης του αντικειμένου τέχνης, όπως συντελέστηκε κατά τη διάρκεια της δεκαετίας του 1960 και του 1970 με την εμφάνιση της ενοιολογικής τέχνης, η οποία έθεσε υπό αμφισβήτηση τόσο τις παραδοσιακές μορφές και πρακτικές της τέχνης, όσο και τις θεωρήσεις που τις περιβάλλουν. Ο Kosuth ήταν ανάμεσα στους πρώτους καλλιτέχνες που χρησιμοποίησαν εγκαταστάσεις, κείμενα, φωτογραφίες και την οικειοποίηση στοιχείων. Για τον Joseph Kosuth η ίδια η τέχνη λειτουργεί κατά κύριο λόγο ως μέσο αμφισβήτησης. Όλες οι απόψεις για το νόημα της τέχνης έχουν αναθεωρηθεί από τον ίδιο, συμπεριλαμβανομένης της λειτουργικότητας των αντικειμένων και του ίδιου του ρόλου της έκθεσης των έργων. Η ουσία της τέχνης είναι σημαντική για την κατανόηση του έργου αυτού του καλλιτέχνη, όπως για παράδειγμα ο τρόπος με τον οποίο παράγει έννοιες ενώ συνάμα επηρεάζεται από το περιβάλλον. Σύμφωνα με τον Kosuth, το οπτικό στοιχείο αποτελεί ένα μόνο μέρος μιας περίπλοκης σύνθεσης που παράγει έννοιες μέσα από την τέχνη και όχι τη βάση της. Από τη δεκαετία του 1960 δανείζεται στοιχεία από εγχειρίδια, τη λογοτεχνία, τη φιλοσοφία, τη θεωρία της επιστήμης και την pop κουλτούρα. Χρησιμοποιεί κληροδοτημένες έννοιες προκειμένου να δημιουργήσει τις δικές του. Όλα αυτά τα χρόνια ο Kosuth έχει συγκεντρώσει τεράστιο υλικό και στο έργο του τα τελευταία 35 χρόνια συγκαταλέγεται ένας εντυπωσιακός αριθμός δημιουργημάτων και εκθέσεων. Γεια σας φίλες και φίλοι, αυτός λοιπόν είναι ο Joseph Kosuth, τον οποίον έχουμε σήμερα μαζί μας και είμαστε πάρα πολύ ευτυχείς γι' αυτό. Θα μιλήσουμε μαζί του και θα προσπαθήσουμε να μπούμε περισσότερο στο νόημα της δουλειάς του, να γνωρίσουμε την προσωπικότητά του όσο μπορούμε καλύτερα. Mr. Kosuth, welcome in Greece, welcome in this State Channel 1 and in this program that has to do with visual arts. And my first question has to do with a question mark. If you had to explain your work to someone who approaches it for the first time, which kind of reading key would you give them?
Well, the first reading, of course, would be the work itself. But I think, you know, that there's always a level of attainable meaning if one lets go of your presumptions about what art can be. And I always thought it was a very simple answer, and then someone told me, this is not simple, Joseph, at all. But I would like, they would say, if, in a very short way, how would you describe your work? What do you work with? And I'd say, oh, I work with the relations between relations, which sounds simple. But the thing is that it's really, I think very much the artist works with very much the relations between things. And in that way, it takes a very linguistic nature. It's to understand that the spaces between words are as important as the words themselves. Gives you an idea that in the construction of a work of art, everything comes into play. And that includes the psychology of the viewer before they approach the work, the discourse of the language and the culture around it, and that the fact is that every work of art floats in the sea of words. And for me, it was a question of whether the language would be dealt with critically through the front door, or it would come in uncritically through the back door.
So, supposing, again, that somebody doesn't know anything about conceptual art, about this definition.
I can't imagine it.
You can imagine it, huh? Because you meet many people in your career. I think that they have this question to explain, to give a definition about conceptual art, which is quite simple for somebody to understand.
Yes, I think that, well, if we, of course, everyone's familiar with modernism, and modernism was an incredibly important part of our cultural inheritance. That our idea of artists was shaped really by modernism. By this point, at the beginning of the next century, and that the experiments within modernism really was questioning the kinds of languages of art. It was the beginning of trying to understand how meaning is produced, I think, in art. And so from that point of view, this was a thread that I pulled out. But the thing is that you have to find, you realize that all these experiments, at the beginning of the century, at the end, really for me in the 60s, 1960s, art had come within modernist context to a kind of formalism in which really artists were put in a position in a way to make a kind of necktie for over the couch. And increasingly it had no meaning. And so artists had to fight back and fight for the meaning of what they were producing. And that has a political dimension as well as a social and a cultural one.
I want to continue this conversation with some of your thoughts, and that's why I've written some of them, because you have said so many things through all those years. And some of them are very important even today for the young artists maybe. So I want to ask you, what is the meaning of your concept that art mainly consists of on the construction of the meaning, the construction of the meaning? This is very important.
Well, it's interesting that how before modernism, in a way it's a continuation of what I started, before modernism, artists worked with meaning. We didn't simply work with forms and colors. You worked with forms and colors in the process of the construction of meaning. What was a very important diversion from the historic activity of the artist as a producer of meaning was within the context of modernism, where one looked at the languages of how meaning is constructed to the point where it became so opaque at the end that what the postmodernist practice that conceptual art began was a return to this understanding that there is the necessity of the artist to take responsibility for the meaning of their work. And they're not simply a cottage industry that produces things in the studio isolated from the social and political reality, but in fact are engaged with society, engaged with all those discourses of meaning that produce consciousness. And for me, this it was a necessity. Of course, I'm a generation from the 60s, very active against the Vietnam War, civil rights before that. So for me, conceptual was a question of authority, the authority of painting and sculpture, the authority of modernism.
Okay, so you drive me to my next thought, which has to do with emotional technology. This is something very interesting.
Did you just say emotional technology?
Yes, you've said that. But I will put it.
Said that.
Look.
No, I said that painting is a sentimental.
Oh, sentimental. Oh, yeah. This is a big difference. Okay. Explain to us which is the difference between these two words.
No, I will explain sentimental technology, and you explain emotional technology.
Okay, let's
Since
play
I never
that.
said that, I don't take any responsibility. But no, the point being is that it has to do with the tradition of painting, that people have, of course, a certain kind of nostalgia and investment in the culture that they grew up in, and these things are understandable. However, if you're a young artist and you want and you realize that you want to be creative and rethink art in a sense, then you realize that you can't simply use a form of art in which the meaning precedes you as much as traditional art does. And so the idea that the brush is of course a technical device, and it does pretty predictable things, and extremely limited in terms of what the idea of art can be. In fact, the problem was, of course, that painting and sculpture, because they're very much linked, as creating a kind of fictive space, have always say ahead of time what the meaning of art is, because it's already established traditionally. And if you're, as a creative person, as an artist, then you have to really question what the nature of art is. And to do that is how you reflect your own moment in history. That's how you make the authentic work for today. Like if you go to a museum, and I always say Velázquez, for example, and you see the power of this work, although it was made at another time, it's the power of the authenticity of art being made at a certain moment. So that's why every artist, I think, wants to do art for their own time, and why it's very difficult now to do work that is traditional.
You were very young when you stopped believing on painting. Is that true?
Yes, but that was because I was very busy painting in my childhood. I went to museum school when I was 10, 11. I had private tutoring, and so I painted a good 10 years by the time I was 20, and had serious questions. And for me to stop painting was not easy at all. I had suffered emotionally very much because I was a very introverted child, and really in some way protected me from the world a little bit. And so, but I still believed in art, even if I didn't believe in painting anymore. And philosophy was always my second interest. And that sort of supported me to rethink what maybe the issues for art in my time could be.
Are these beliefs the result that brought you close to philosophy, in a way?
Well, philosophy was always a parallel second interest. And at a certain point you begin to look, when certain things are used up. I always loved in the book Understanding Media of Marshall McLuhan. There's a quote at the beginning of an adult saying to a child, this was written, I think, in the very early 60s, and the adult says to the child, why do you say cool when you really mean hot? And the child says, because you used up hot before we came along. And in a certain way, that is about, in a certain way, things becoming so loaded with prior meaning that they can't be used anymore. The way the farmer changes the crops in the field. It's a similar kind of way. And I suppose that sort of, it leads to certain consequences.
What about cultural anthropology? I would like some explanations on that, and in turn, your work, Artist as an Anthropologist, which I find very interesting also. And I want to say here for all our friends that they are listening to this conversation, that artist as an anthropologist is a meaning that it's very hopeful for the arts for this generation. And, you know, it's a hope that you have to continue because you are doing something more than being nice to other people because of your work, or you are doing something that people like to buy or to put in their houses. This is something more that you say, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first, to respond just to the last part, one has to understand that artists are not simply making, if they're successful, expensive things to decorate the home. That there is a very important part of the whole social fabric that the artist contributes. And in the whole dynamic of the production of consciousness, which brings in really the way in which well, let me say, that if an artist, it begins really at the point of production, an artist really taking responsibility for their own subjective role, and that when that is put into play, that they follow the implications of that, and they stick to all the, you know, one of my favorite philosophers, Wittgenstein, said that ethics and aesthetics were the same, and this gives a certain moral force to the artists and their role. It's a long-term view, a long-term job. Quite different than most activities in the society. Very interesting. I tell my students, you know, one of the interesting things about our job is that artists never retire. It's not a job. Like a philosopher never retires.
That's true. How do you feel with this kind of life that you've chosen?
Oh, I absolutely have always thought I had the best job in the world.
Really?
Because, yes, it's the largest sense of independence. Your sense of independence can only go so far because meaning is very much dependent on community. So your activity is very much caught up in the larger social and cultural context. So there's no ultimate isolation of independence in that sense. But in terms of being able to make decisions about what's important within your activity and doing things for their own integrity, rather than for I mean, I consider the whole thing. I think being half of an artist, and people were shocked when I said this 30 years ago, but that half of being an artist is putting it in the world and fighting for it. You know, and you have to get out of your studio. That's why, I mean, I travel all over the world, and I work in the countries, and I go there and I try to understand something, and my work really comes out of the historic and cultural context of where I show, and I do it in the local language always. Even though I'm a person who works with language, if I did it in English everywhere, I mean, English is so problematic. Particularly, it's so problematic being an American today.
Why?
It's like a colonial language.
Why?
In a way.
Tell us why is it problematic.
Well, that's a whole other program, really. I have great serious disagreement with what my country is doing, and at the same time, I feel a responsibility as a U.S. citizen who lives mostly abroad to try to be one of the citizens that can give another meaning to having an American passport, because I think that there's a whole web of relationships my country has developed for decades, which has been destroyed in this administration, and it's very, very, I think, whether it's the environment, whatever it is, all the decisions have been the wrong ones. So I'm happy about the present state of things.
I understand what you say, but I also think that you are a very lucky person as an artist because you are born in America and you are using in your work a language that everybody speaks all over the world those days. And I'm wondering, if you were not born in America and you were you were coming from another part of the world, what would you do with this work? What kind of language would you use?
You know, it's really a difficult question because, of course, something else is something else. And my work very much came out of who I am, where I was born, and, of course, my critical relationship with my own country's politics and much of the culture that it's exported. There's a whole process of, with a global market economy, you have a global culture. And I'd like to think that my work has been, in some sense, a critical voice in relation to the globalization process. But at the same time, it's not without its own paradox, because of course I'm an American artist who's global. I've been showing all over the world.
Yeah.
But you know, where other Americans go and do things I don't agree with, I have my own contribution to make, which is perhaps in a sense, perhaps too elliptical, I don't know, but in fact it constitutes a critique to a lot of American presence in the world. And that, in the true sense of, if we want to think that I come from a democratic country, that's part of my responsibility, and it should be seen as a positive, and realizing that a lot of it's my political responsibility as a person involved in cultural activity to dissent from what it means this day to be an American.
So let's come back to your artistic work.
Yeah.
And I would like to ask you, which are the criteria that you are choosing some special texts and languages also? Because you are not using always American language, English language, but
no,
you are using texts from... We also have seen Greek texts from very important parts of our literature that you are using in your work.
Yes. I go into wherever the exhibition is, the installation particularly, and use things. See, I feel a certain responsibility to connect where I'm showing, and in the sense that you were speaking about earlier, that and particularly for public works that are not in a museum context, and in this case, it's the Hellenic American Union. It has many activities, and it's not strictly art. So you have a lot of people coming into the institution that are not there for the art, and so this makes it interesting. It makes it a little more like doing a work in a public context than in a museum, which is always a specialized activity. And I always felt that there was some responsibility for the non-specialist to have some accessible aspect to your work for the non-specialist, that they can learn something and get something and be enriched without having a degree in art history or being someone who's someone familiar with the art scene, and to do that without compromising your problematic as an artist is very important, so that the specialist also understands what's new there and what's been added to it, so that there's different levels and layers of meaning that can be unfolded depending on your background. So for me, this is part of the fun of the job.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
But do you perceive your work as prophetic, considering the turn of art those days, how art has been,
And you mean the early work, or what?
I mean, how do you feel when you were first telling all those thoughts in 1960, and when you tried to turn your art to something else that had to do with text and everything?
Well, I suppose in its defense, the work came out of, in one level, very, very personal terms of my solving my problems with painting that I no longer believed in while I believed in art. So in that sense, I always like to say that conceptual art is more expressionist with a small e, in the sense that it's personal and it's authentic, whereas expressionism with a capital E, in fact, is fairly predictable. They pretty much look the same, and in terms of a level of creativity, expressionist art is very, very limited. Whereas conceptual art is much less prescriptive, much more open, and as we can see, I began my work in the 60s, and we have quite a few years have passed, and it continues to be a way of working for a series of generations. I always like to say, I found out that, you know, at the beginning, I had, so people would even know it was art, I had to give it a special name called conceptual art. And as years went by, I realized the artists were doing it and just calling it art. And I realized that we had succeeded at something. And now a younger artist just calls it art. You don't need to call it conceptual art.
I would like to give to our friends an example on your work. And I will use this title of your work that has to do with 1 and 3 pans, 1 and 3 chairs, 1 and 3, whatever. We want an explanation. What is one and what other thing is the 3 parts of it? Because there is an explanation on this. It has to do with the relations between
the most well-known work, of course, is the 1 and 3 chairs, which is in the Museum of Modern Art, and which is one of well, it was the first in that specific series. And you have a chair, and you have and then in the middle, and on the left you have a photograph in which, when you look at the actual chair and you look at the photograph, you see the same thing. Chair is the same size, same floor, same wall. But one is two-dimensional, the other is real. And then on the right is the text from the dictionary that describes what a chair is. And so, in one sense, you have 1 chair, but you also have 3 chairs. Right? And it's as simple as that. For me, what I love about this work, and I love about art in general when it happens, is when the elements are very simple, but what they suggest are quite complex. And there's been a lot written on it, and I don't want to spoil it for everybody by my giving a final answer, of course.
Tell us more about the relations between language and art. And you say that there are no limits, as there are no limits between words and images. So tell us about those limits.
Well, the thing is that within the play of an artwork, you know, even I've used images throughout my career, but people always talk about the text. But the fact is, there are some artists who work with words, but that's not me. I work with language, and it has to do with the kinds of relations. So it's a linguistic play. So the works, I use photos. The photos function linguistically as much as the words do, right? And for me, it's, you know, as you know, my work began with what now is called appropriation, because for me it was important to take things that were existing and give them a new meaning. And so as I was working a lot with text, I would steal the text. And people would say, you know, and have said, you know, like, well, you know, I mean, it's not even, you didn't even write this, it's stolen. And I would say, well, you know, but in fact, every writer works with words invented by others. And we take these words and we create new meaning. And in my case, it's the same, except instead of single words, I use whole sentences, paragraphs, texts. I've even used whole libraries to create works. And with, and because really what you are, you're speaking between the elements. It's that space. The best illustration of this is a story I tell about a show in Los Angeles I did, where they always, the LA artists were always, I was quite friendly with, but on the other hand, I was just too much of a New York intellectual, and they said, do you always have to be so serious? And I said, well, listen, I promise you, I always will do Kosuth light when I come to California. And it was a kind of running joke among me and the artists in LA. And in some ways I would try. I would think at the end it would be no less serious, but on the surface we would do this. And so I did an exhibition, which I took cartoons, and I was talking about this recently with someone. I took cartoons of, you know, from the newspaper that we all love, and particularly I love, and these would be silk screen on glass that was illuminated, and behind, and then there'd be another element, completely separate object, which would be a text from Hegel or Kierkegaard or Kant, or Aristotle or Plato, or
Yes.
and these two would be I would choose the cartoon and choose the text, very special, particular way that there would be this resonance between them, and they would hang together as one work, these two parts. So I arrived at the gallery in LA for the opening a little late because of traffic in Los Angeles, and I had there collectors, several of which were Hollywood lawyers and collectors of mine, and I came over and they said, Joseph, we're really worried. I mean, you know, did you get permission to use these cartoons? And I said, no, actually, I've been stealing my whole career, and I've never gotten permission, and I never got even a complaint in the letter from anyone. And so they said, well, you know, you really can't do that. You can get in trouble. And I looked at them and I said, well, listen, I said, see that cartoon? That's not my work. See the text by Hegel? It's not my work. My work is the space between the two. I'm not in the donut business. I'm in the donut hole business. Right.
Okay.
And now, you know, I've told that story before, but I tell it again.
Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's nice because, you know, it's a kind of identity. When you say that, because you are who you are, there is a meaning on this.
Well, the thing is to show that it's the production of the new meaning, the surplus meaning of these elements that come with one kind of meaning. It's just like taking colors. If you're a traditional painter and you use red and blue, you didn't invent the red or the blue, but you certainly would like to get credit for inventing a new work. And in certain kinds of parallel way, except language is far richer than any color.
Do you think that the way that you are using language is very close to what ready-made of Marcel Duchamp was?
Well, yes, we all have, I think, we all learn from our elders in this way. And in fact, even my enemies credit me with a I don't want to say redefinition, but a kind of additional meaning to Duchamp in the second half of the century after my analysis in the 60s. And I pulled out certain aspects of Duchamp, the idea of the ready-made, and developed it, and the whole idea of appropriation, of course, comes out of that. There was much of Dada and much of other aspects of Duchamp that I did not, it was not part of. It was very much a local cultural historical dimensions of Duchamp that were far less interesting. But that one point I thought was a really very important one. And because Duchamp was there, of course, you know, the first part of the 20th century, you could say, is like a two-line struggle between Duchamp on one hand and Picasso on the other. And we know at the second half of the century who won. It wasn't Picasso.
Who was?
It was Duchamp.
That's for sure.
Yeah, very much so. And it's, I always telling my collectors, you know, buy Duchamp. Don't buy Picasso, because he did far fewer works. He's going to be far more important. But now they're sorry they didn't.
Well, it sounds to me like a propaganda, Mr. Kosuth, but it's okay. Would you like to tell us some other artists of your generation that you think that you went all this road together, that you had all this distance with some people, that you had a dialogue and you changed opinions and things like this? Which are those people? I mean,
no, for me, at that moment, the ones I mean, in a certain way, in a New York art world context, my career was, in a sense, it began, I was first very much alone at the very beginning, and there was these articles, but I was being treated as this eccentric, and the kind of expressionist monographic tradition of this strange guy doing these strange works that were not about, you know, the usual things. And there was a big article in Newsweek and the New Art, and I was kind of a little bit flabbergasted by the way it was being presented. And I realized that no one's going to take my ideas seriously as long as I was the only one who had them, because that would always be dealt with as this kind of
very serious that you say.
Yeah, and
very
so
serious.
I sort of went out to put together an art movement, looked for other artists doing things related, and of course I wrote all the theoretical texts at the beginning. And
just a moment.
I was accused of having
just
an
a moment.
Breton.
I want to ask you something here.
Yeah, sure.
You mean that you were trying to make a circle of certain people around you that you could
well, not even around me, around a body of ideas.
About
so that the ideas
yes,
would be
course.
important, not the personalities. Because, you see, the prejudice of art historians, and particularly at that time, was the expressionist model of the artist. Because essentially the art historians like expressionist artists who don't say anything and make nature that they can make culture from.
Right.
And so artists that actually could speak for themselves, I mean, it was kind of a horrifying idea. And they still, I think, many art historians and critics, the idea that an artist can actually be articulate and know what they believe in and what they want is kind of, I've been told by gallerists, you've hurt your career, Joseph, shut up. But I didn't.
So, do you remember some of those people now?
Well, of course, I still know many of them. You know, I mean, in terms of the context of conceptual art, the people I felt who, you know, were doing a kind of work parallel to mine, independent of me, it was such as members of Art and Language, specifically Terry Atkinson and Michael Baldwin, I mean, many things came later, which from a group called Art and Language that had no real connection to the original historic group, where they kind of took the name and went off with it, which I don't really agree with. But at that point, the dialogue with them was a very valuable one. But as I was saying, in the context of the American context, as they of course lived in England, you know, the three others of Barry, Wiener, Hubler, we were all sort of presented to the world together in very early shows, which got a lot of attention, and we were seen as the original group. I was much younger. I was the spokesperson, but I was the youngest. So this created certain tensions. I was born in 1945, and Doug Hubler was a sergeant in the Marines in the Second World War. Just to give you an idea of the difference. But Douglas wasn't the problem, actually, at all. He was a very, very fine human being, and he died a few years ago, and it was very, very sad that he did, because he was a really fantastic person and a great teacher. But as far as the rest, you know, everybody went on their way, and for me, much of the work was much more post-minimalist, much more modernist. The work of Art and Language was much more of the postmodernist practice at the early Art and Language I speak of, not the stuff now, but at that time.
So let's discuss about this last show here in Athens that you came for in Hellenic American Union.
My first one in Greece.
Your first one in Greece. Yeah. We've seen your work from time to time to Deste Foundation and to Dexion Collection, and also books, many books on your work. This is the first time I think I'm doing. But it's the first time you're doing.
I'm doing something in Greece that I wasn't brought here by the Takis.
And the title of it is Guests and Foreigners, Rules and Meanings, Athens. Yes. Because of the Olympic Games. Well,
it's a series of works. This is my 10th, and I've done them around the world, dealing with this idea of being a guest or a foreigner. And it began in Oslo. I had a retrospective at the Museum of Oslo, and this was the new installation. There were a couple other works before. The pavilion at the Venice Biennale was the beginning of doing this kind of installation, and also the Ratti Foundation in Como. But strictly speaking, this work, Guests and Foreigners, began in Oslo, and it dealt with the philosopher Wittgenstein period as an Austrian living in a little house on a fjord in Norway. And after that, I was invited to Dublin to the Irish Museum of Modern Art to do also retrospective, and this was the new work. And this was a very large, it's a very, very large building. And I had over 30 assistants, and we worked for, I think, about 4 or 5 weeks on it. Yeah. And it was a big undertaking. But this had to do with Joyce out of Ireland, and Wittgenstein, the end of his life, being there. I'll go through them if you want. The next one was in Frankfurt, and it was the 250th birthday of Goethe. And I was invited by the city to do an installation in honor of Goethe. So I did one of these installations about the period Goethe was on his Italian journey. And so it was Goethe as a guest and foreigner in Italy.
I see.
And then it proceeded, I've done it in New Zealand about the English and the Maori Indians, in Japan, the 300 years of isolation of Japan. I did in Hong Kong, in New York, Boston.
Okay, and now in Athens.
Η σχέση με τον Joseph Kosuth είναι πρώτα απ' όλα φιλική. Ξεκίνησε όταν μετά από την έκθεση του Τέρι Άτκινσον, ο Τέρι ανέφερε στον Joseph ότι θα μπορούσαμε να κάνουμε κάποιο project μαζί. Ο Τέρι είναι κάποιος άλλος ενοιολογικός καλλιτέχνης και πολύ φίλος του Joseph Kosuth. Ο Joseph τότε ζήτησε να μπει το δικό μου πορτοφόλιο, γιατί τον ενδιαφέρει πρώτα απ' όλα εάν η δικιά μου αισθητική είναι σύμφωνη με τη δικιά του. Και μετά αυτό συνέχισε μια ανταλλαγή έργων, τέχνης μεταξύ μας, μέχρι που ήρθε η ώρα που συνεργαστήκαμε σε αυτήν την έκθεση. Η συγκεκριμένη εγκατάσταση χρειάστηκε προετοιμασία ενός χρόνου. Αρχίσαμε από κατόψεις, διαμορφώσαμε το χώρο ειδικά για την έκθεση, γιατί ήταν σαν τη specific. Εργάστηκαν πάρα πολλά άτομα, 12 εθελοντές, κάποιοι από τη Σχολή Καλών Τεχνών, κάποιοι από τη Φιλοσοφική και κάποια άτομα από την ίδια την Ελληνοαμερικάνικη Ένωση. Εκτός αυτού υπήρχε ένα αρκετά μεγάλο team του ίδιου του Joseph, που ήρθε από Παρίσι, από Ρώμη, 7 άτομα για να διαμορφωθεί. Όπως ξέρουμε όλοι, είναι ο μεγαλύτερος καλλιτέχνης πάνω στην ενοιολογική τέχνη. Εκείνο που το χαρακτηρίζει είναι η σχέση των σχέσεων. Δηλαδή, τα κείμενα ατόφια δεν είναι η δουλειά του, είναι η σχέση των κειμένων μεταξύ τους. Δηλαδή, ο θεατής που θα έρθει εδώ πέρα και διαβάσει τα κείμενα θα ανακαλύψει κάποια νοήματα και κάποιες πλευρές που δεν είχε συνειδητοποιήσει αν διάβαζε το κάθε ένα ξεχωριστά. Οπότε αυτό είναι το σημαντικότερο σημείο της έκθεσης. Είναι πολύ σημαντικό ότι έρχονται άνθρωποι πάρα πολύ απλοί, οι οποίοι δεν ξέρουν τίποτα σχετικά με την ενοιολογική τέχνη, δεν ξέρουν τίποτα σχετικά με τον Joseph Kosuth. Διαβάζουν τα κείμενα και λένε αυτό πράγματι δεν είχα σκεφτεί ποτέ ότι αυτό ταιριάζει με αυτό, ότι αυτό αναφέρεται σε αυτό. Αποκτάει καινούριο νόημα.
I'm right behind you.
Αυτή είναι η 10η έκθεση Guest and Foreigns, Rules and Meanings, δηλαδή φιλοξενούμενοι και ξένοι, κανόνες και νόηματα. Η ίδια έκθεση έχει παρουσιαστεί σε μερικούς από τους σημαντικότερους χώρους εκθεσιακούς σε όλο τον κόσμο. Έχει σημασία αυτό γιατί μερικά από τα βασικά κείμενα της έκθεσης εκδοσιούνται ατόφια σε όλες αυτές τις εκθέσεις. Δηλαδή είναι ο συνθετικός κρίκος. Δηλαδή τα κείμενα του Wittgenstein, του American Etiquette, υπάρχουν το κείμενο της Mary Douglas που είναι από το βιβλίο Rules and Meanings, που από αυτό προέρχεται και ο τίτλος της έκθεσης. Υπάρχουν σε όλες τις εκθέσεις Guest and Foreigns του Joseph Kosuth. Ξεκίνησε σαν ιδέα, εμπνεύστηκε τη συγκεκριμένη κατάσταση από την έκθεση που είχαν προτείνει στο Μουσείο του Όσλο, όπου σκέφτηκε ότι ο Wittgenstein, ο αγαπημένος του φιλόσοφος, είναι φιλοξενούμενος και ξένος και προσπάθησε να βρει τη σχέση του με το να ζει σε ένα άλλο πολιτισμό. Οπότε από εκεί πέρα άρχισε να βλέπει αυτή την εγκατάσταση που είχε να κάνει πάντοτε με δύο πολιτισμούς. Στη συγκεκριμένη περίπτωση, εδώ πέρα μιλάμε για τις επιρροές του αμερικανικού πολιτισμού προς τον ελληνικό και του ελληνικού προς το αμερικανικό. Γι' αυτό εμφανίζεται και στοιχεία από την ιστορία της ελληνικής ιστορίας και της αμερικάνικης ιστορίας μέσα στα πλαίσια των Ολυμπιακών Αγώνων.
Don't look now. I'm right behind you.
What would you teach to somebody who is very young, and you are a teacher, you are a professor,
Yeah.
to Venice and to Germany?
Now in Munich,
In
the
Munich.
Kunst Academy in Munich.
And you are teaching young people, young artists. They want to be. We don't know if they will be. What is the best to teach to somebody who is starting his career now, and who is living in this very specific age that we have to do with many, many pictures and many, many words everywhere, advertising, information through television, everywhere. How somebody who is very young could behave in front of those huge informations? And
well, I'm asked this actually by the students often, and when I in the mid '60s and I was a student, and we had abstract expressionism, we had pop art, we had minimal art, and many of my fellow students just said, everything's been done. It's all used up. There's nothing new we can do. And of course that's absurd if you think about it, because every new life has a new world, and from that you make the art that is the right art for your time. So the job's always the same in a way. You just have to look in another place, and you have to find a real and authentically personal relationship to all that information. And also, in a way, there's an implicit critique of the society you've inherited. I think that there's always a political dimension to art. I mean, of course, it's famous, the idea that avant-garde is a military term from France, everyone always says. But there is an aspect that if art is to be alive and have meaning, that it has to have a political life. That doesn't mean you reduce the artwork to being a truck delivering a political message, because art that is political in that obvious way, I mean, it's very interesting. On the right or the left, the work is the same, and it's conservative. Whether it was socialist realism or the art of fascism, it has this conservative aspect, because the politics has to be internal in a much more subtle way to have the power, I think, to be truly political, and because it's part of the production of our consciousness, and that is something that's much more complex and subtle than simply delivering a political message. But it does have to have, I think, that political consciousness of the artist and that critical relationship to the society. It's part of our responsibility as artists to do that. But as it criticizes that, it also creates something new, and that reflects a new point of view of someone who is younger.
And I would like to finish with a question more sentimental. I would like to ask you, how do you feel about somebody who is coming to you all those years, viewers, I mean, collectors, anybody, and if somebody tells you that, look, I don't understand what you're doing, but I appreciate what you're doing. I don't like this for my house, for example, but I want this for my museum. How do you feel about this? I mean that you have a very special team of people that come close to your work and to your ideas. How do you feel about this?
Well, it takes all kinds of ways. I mean, for me, part of what, the enrichment of my life is all those people I meet in the context of my work. And I like the idea that my work is in someone's home, even though it's unusual, except for certain kinds of collectors. And I have a special relationship with them because of it. Because it's not something that's simply decorative. It's something they live with, they have to think about, right? And that's not it for everyone. And of course, I understand that. But on one hand, there's a collector, but also all the people I work with. For example, Artemis, who has done such an amazing job for me on this show. I never could have done this without her dedication and the quality of the work she's done. So for me, I've learned from this an enriching experience of people I meet in the context of doing shows in the various places. It's and also everything I learn, I use in the next installation too.
So, Mr. Kosuth, I thank you very, very much for this discussion. Would you like to tell us a Greek word that you would choose from our language and that you adore or you appreciate a lot? Do you know any Greek words?
That's exactly what you find when you come to my opening on May 5th.
Okay, and for somebody who is not living in Athens and cannot come there, which is the word, can we say?
they'll hear it from their friends, I suppose.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Κυρίες και κύριοι, ήμασταν με τον Joseph Kosuth, μια σπουδαία φυσιογνωμία της σύγχρονης τέχνης, της ενιολογικής τέχνης. Ελπίζω να κατανοήσατε μέσα από τη συζήτησή μας τι είναι αυτό που κάνει και τι υποστηρίζει με τόσο πάθος όλη τη ζωή. Εάν μπορέσετε να επισκεφτείτε την Έλληνο-Αμερικανική Ένωση, όπου η έκθεσή του θα διαρκέσει μέχρι και το Σεπτέμβριο, σε επιμέλεια της εικαστικού αλλά και επιμελήτριας Artemis Potamianou, την οποία ακούσαμε και να μας μιλάει λίγο για το έργο του. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ που μείνατε μαζί μας. Σας χαιρετώ. Ραντεβού την επόμενη Κυριακή. Γεια σας.